Chaos Breaker Dragon is here, and oh boy, is it good! Stand up, Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we've got a lot of new reveals and a lot of new news. We've got the new Shiryuki support, we also got the entire thing for Jewel Knights, as well as the new Starvator with Chaos Breaker Dragon for Link Joker. And to not make this video longer than it should be, we're gonna split this all up into multiple videos in the coming days. So today we're going to focus on the main bad boy himself, which is of course Chaos Breaker Dragon and his support cards. Then tomorrow I'm going to take a look at the new Jewel Knights for Royal Paladin, which is really interesting because they have a very specific playstyle. And then Thursdays we're going to take a look at the new Shiryuki support cards because I want to take my time talking about those cards because they open up a lot of interesting plays and options for the Shiryuki deck itself. And then of course the day after that, Friday, we're going to get the reveal for Narukami with the blood. So, the coming days, we're going to talk about a lot of new cards and a lot of new reveals, but that's because there's a lot to talk about here. So, without any further ado, let's jump straight into the cards for today's video, because we have to talk about the new Link Joker support. And the first one that we're going to take a look at is a new grade 1, which is Starvator Craving Claw. And this card already confirms us that luck, and I mean the actual opponent luck, is going to return to Vanguard, because its skills are Auto and Vanguard and Vanguard Circle. When it attacks or the attack it boosted hits a Vanguard, look at the 5 cards from the top of your deck, reveal up to 1 card with Starvator in its card name from among them, and put them into your hand and shuffle your deck. Now, this isn't as powerful as all the other archetype surges that we saw with the top 7, but at the same time, it's maybe even better, because yes, it only checks top 5 and it's on an attack that it needs to hit, but it searches for a lot of cards. It searches for itself, it searches for the grade 2, and it searches, of course, for Chaos Breaker Dragon. And if we ever get more support, it will probably search for that. So it has a lot more longevity to it than all those other grade 1 cards. And in Premium, it's even better because it will probably search for your entire deck. So that's actually a pretty good skill that's free, and it's actually a free plus. But then it also has a secondary effect, which is Act on Rearguard Circle. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater cost, put this unit into your soul, choose up to one of your opponent's luck cards, and unlock it. If you unlocked a card, choose one of your opponent's rearguards other than the unlocked card and lock it. So basically what this card allows you to do is change a locked card to another unit. So maybe if you locked the card or your opponent chose a specific card to be locked somewhere and you don't like that specific card to be locked, then you can use the skill to lock something else. And you might think to yourself, what's the actual point of this? Well, to basically explain the main use of this card in the generic sense, if your opponent has a back row unit locked, you can use the skill to change that lock position to the front row, thus securing a attack that cannot happen for that particular turn. So it helps you to control more on the board. But it has a more specific application if we're going to take a look at the Chaos Breaker Dragon skills, and then it will make more sense of what the actual application of this card actually is. But before we're going to take a look at Chaos Breaker Dragon, let's take a look at the new grade 2, which is also really good, and it has some synergy with this particular grade 1, because that grade 2 is splitting Starvator Zirconium, and of course it has a Starvator name, which means it's searchable with the grade 1, but the main use of this card is because of its first ability, which is Auto and Vanguard and Rearguard Circle skill. When placed, if you have a Vanguard with Starvator in his card name, aka himself or any other grade 2, or maybe your grade 3 Vanguard, that's Chaos Breaker Dragon, cost counterblast 1, your opponent looks at the top card of his third deck and puts it on an open rearguard circle as a locked card. If that locked card was put into the back row, you draw a card, and this unit gets power plus 10k until the end of turn. So basically, it circumvents the counterplay of Chaos Breaker Dragon or the generic lock playstyle where opponent just doesn't have a board. This way, they can at least get a lock card onto the field if your opponent by putting the top card of the deck onto the field. Now, your opponent gets some control over where this card is put, but because of this skill, you will heavily incentivize your opponent to put it into the front row, but if they put it into the front row, they lose a potential attack. Now, Axel decks might not really mind this at all because they can generate more attacks because of the generation of Exo Circles, but at the same time it at least limits one attacks. Now for Force and Protect, this is more hurtful because they only have 2 extra potential rearguard swings, so they want to put it into the back row. But then you get the extra power and draw potential, which is really good for the Chaos Breaker Dragon player, so this gives players choices to say what they really want to do. But if we combine it with the grade 1, it doesn't really matter, because even if they put it into the back row and you gain that extra advantage, you can use the grade 1 to then unlock that back row unit and then lock a front row unit if there is a front row circle filled with a unit, thus making the choice be for naught. So it's some interesting synergies and can basically screw with your opponent a lot. But this card also has a second effect, which is continuous rearguard circle. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, and your opponent has a locked card, the original critical of all of your Vanguards becomes 2. So we've seen this time and time again to other Force decks, basically the way that you can generate the effect of Force 2. So we're going to see that Chaos Breaker Dragon is going to play with Force 1. But that's a pretty funny statement to make, especially once you see Chaos Breaker Dragon, because we might or might not actually be playing with Force. And that all has to do with Chaos Breaker Dragon himself. So let's take a look at the big bad himself, as here we have Starvator, Chaos Breaker Dragon. And probably one thing you might immediately notice is the absence of a Force marker on the card. So if you write this thing, it doesn't gain a Force marker. But that doesn't mean we're not gonna play with Force markers, because it all has to do with all the skills that Chaos Breaker Dragon has access to. Because his first ability is continuous Vanguard to rearguard circle. During a turn, if your opponent has a locked card, this unit gets power plus 10k. Very generic, it can become a stronger beater, and combined with the grade 2, you basically have a 23k unit, which swings with double critical, which is nice. But then we have its secondary effect, which is act on Vanguard Circle once a turn, cost counter plus 1. Your opponent gets an imaginary gift Force. This is really weird, but wait a minute. You choose one of your opponent's rearguards and lock it. So you lock one of your opponent's rearguards, but in exchange you give them a Force marker. Now, interesting enough, you can immediately negate the Force marker because your opponent probably puts it under one of their units, and then you can immediately lock that unit, and then the Force marker doesn't really do anything. Now, they can be smart and put it onto an open rearguard circle, but if you have the grid 2, you can use the grid 2, and if that's the only open circle, then again, the Force marker will be for naught. So there's an interesting synergy here, but really interesting that you give your opponents Force markers. And this means that Exo player and Protect players also can potentially acquire the Force marker, which is really interesting. But this all has to do with the fact that Chaos Breaker Dragon doesn't have a Force marker, and because of its third and probably its main effect. Because its third ability is Auto on Vanguard Circle. Note, not once per turn. When your opponent's locked card is unlocked, cost Soul Blast 1, retire one of those unlocked units, you draw a card. Your opponent removes a total of 2 markers from his or her circles or Protect from his or her hand, and you get an imaginary gift Force for each marker or Protect removed. So, ladies and gentlemen, we actually have marker destruction, or in this case, marker theft, because Chaos Breaker Dragon just steals the markers for himself. And now, his second effect makes a lot more sense, because you give them a Force marker, and then at the end of the turn, you basically take that Force marker for your own. Now, the main issue here is that Chaos Breaker Dragon is relatively slow, because you're getting the Force marker at the end of the turn when those cards get unlocked at the end of your opponent's turn. So you write Chaos Breaker Dragon, you don't do anything with it, you don't get the Force markers, then it's your opponent's turn. There is a potential that they can use those Force markers if you haven't locked these specific circles, and then at the end of their turn, they unlock their units, and then you steal the markers for yourself. So it's not as fast as you like to be in the normal circumstances. But this is where the grade 1 comes into play, because that grade 1 allows us to unlock our opponent's rearguard and then lock something else, which means we give our opponent the force marker, and then we can use that grade 1 to immediately unlock it during our turn, and then immediately steal those markers and gain more force during our turn to be more aggressive. And because the grade 1 goes into the soul, you actually immediately pay for the cost that this skill requires you. So you can actually use this skill potentially multiple times a turn if you have more of those grade 1s, which is really, really good because it allows you to disrupt your opponent's plays. Now, the important thing to note here is that if you went first, this skill is relatively underwhelming because your opponent is probably still at grade 2, so they don't have any marker. You give them one force marker and then you potentially can steal it. So you just have one force marker. So you just basically have the same as if you just read normally and you had the force marker printed on the card. So the Chaos Breaker Dragon isn't really good going first besides the lock plays that you have potential to. But if you went second, it's an entire different story because then you can steal that specific marker and potentially 2 markers if you give them the force marker. And you can do that proactively if you have the grade 1 in your hand or on the field. And this is extremely powerful against any deck that accelerates their markers. So Chaos Breaker Dragon is basically the answer to the current meta environment. It counters Luward, it counters Gurgwit, it counters Vanguard to some extent, it counters even Gear Chronicle, even though it pains me to say it, but it does. Any deck that accelerates their markers, Chaos Breaker Dragon, can really disrupt their plays, especially with the combination of their lock plays that they have access to. And Chaos Breaker Dragon has some older support that actually makes sense here. Because Chaos Breaker Dragon, if you don't know it, is a Cyber Dragon, which means it can utilize the Cyber Dragon support cards. And one of those cards is Gravity Collapse Dragon. And this grade 2 has a very interesting on-hit skill because it allows you to potentially superior right into Chaos Breaker Dragon, thus have a superior right engine within the clan. And if we combine this with the grade 2 that can lock something, we can start getting our lock potential very early on, even if our opponent is still at grade 1 or grade 2. But be aware, you cannot use the grade 2 on the turn 2 play itself. You first need to superior right into Starvator Chaos Breaker Dragon because you need that Starvator name. So be careful when applying that combo, but the fact that you can superior right into Chaos Breaker Dragon is a really good thing. But talking about the grade 2 and Chaos Breaker Dragon, you might notice that all of the skills that allow you to lock something cost a counterblast, which means the deck is quite counterblast heavy, so there is some counterplay available for our opponent here. Now, luckily for us, there is a card that allows us to countercharge something, but it's kind of awkward for Chaos Breaker Dragon because we've got Nordstorm Dragon, a grade 3 Cyber Dragon support card, which works with Chaos Breaker Dragon. But the problem with this card is that it binds one of your opponent's rear guards. So if our opponent only has one rear guard and we have no counterblast face up, we need to resolve this card to gain the count charge, but then we bind that unit, which then means we have no card to lock with Chaos Breaker Dragon. That said, if we have the grade 2, then this isn't really a problem because we just lock something from the top of your deck. But if we don't have access to that grade 2, we cannot really do anything. So as we see, Chaos Breaker Dragon has some good support cards or some nice little interaction cards with this Cyber Dragon archetype, and at the same time it counters current meta relevant decks. But in that same breath, we see the problems that Chaos Breaker Dragon has. Because I want to address this before anybody is screaming that Chaos Breaker Dragon is going to power creep everything or going to destroy the game. No, not necessarily, because there are some very apparent flaws with the deck. First off, it needs a lot of counterblast. So you can damage deny Chaos Breaker Dragon quite effectively. Also, Chaos Breaker Dragon isn't really good going first. So it's a going second deck, and it relies on your opponent to actually accelerate their markers. If they do not do that, Chaos Breaker Dragon just relies on their lock skills, and if your opponent can navigate around that, then Chaos Breaker Dragon is pretty generic and pretty bland. But even on top of that, there are more inherent flaws with the deck itself. One important thing to note here is that because it's a going second deck, means any strong OTK grade 3 deck overwhelms Chaos Breaker Dragon on a consistent basis. Especially since their early game is really weak, because most of their earlier cards, like the grade 1 and grade 2, relies on you being grade 3 or your opponent being grade 3. So something like Gavriel can OTK them out of nowhere. Maybe even Angerblader can OTK them out of nowhere. But those two cards are rearguard reliant, so if Chaos Breaker Dragon survives long enough that it can actually start locking things, then they might be in trouble. But the Cross has none of the problems because the Cross is a Vanguard related deck and they can just go with just one Force 2, so that they have double critical, and any other power gain that they get is from their Calamity Tower Wyvern. And if they have one open rearguard circle, they can call it there and use its skill multiple times and just probably kill the Chaos Breaker Dragon, because so far it doesn't seem that they have good enough draw potential to survive into the long haul, because if they cannot rely on the draw potential of Chaos Breaker Dragon, it doesn't really do anything. Now, on top of that, another interesting thing opens up, because Chaos Breaker Dragon, if it doesn't have access to the Grade 1 and the Grade 2, it doesn't really do anything, especially if we're up against a deck that can remove its entire field. Because if you do not have access to the Grade 2, the only way to lock a card is by directly lock a rearguard with his own skill. But if our opponent is playing a waifu deck, and I'm referring to Night Rose or Lucriere, Chaos Breaker Dragon just instantly lose. Because if they do not draw into the Grade 2, Night Rose has no field, Lucriere has no field, Chaos Breaker Dragon cannot lock anything, thus it cannot give you markers, thus it cannot acquire markers, thus it's just a vanilla 13k Vanguard. And then Chaos Breaker Dragon is really, really weak. So if you do not get the Grade 2 against those specific decks, Chaos Breaker Dragon is just a vanilla 13k Vanguard. And that sounds really, really bad. And another very interesting counterplay to Chaos Breaker Dragon is any generic protect deck. Because Chaos Breaker Dragon relies on destroying those markers to gain more value over time. But the interesting thing about protect markers, and more precisely protect 1 markers, is that the player can remove them from the game by just normal game circumstances or by normal game rulings, because it's a card in hand. So the protect player has 2 options available to him. They can proactively remove those protect markers from their hand. Think of discard skills during their turn. So they write, gain a protect marker, and then immediately use a discard ability to discard it to the drop zone and then have no protect markers in hand. This means the Chaos Breaker Dragon can only acquire 1 marker a turn with its own ability, so they are forced to lock something to then give the opponent a force marker to then take that force marker, which is really slow and inconsistent. Now, if they have access to the Grade 1, they can potentially use it much faster and at least apply a bit of pressure, but it's the same as if Chaos Breaker Dragon had the force marker printed on the card itself, which doesn't really change anything. So the protect player can proactively remove that. But if the Chaos Breaker Dragon doesn't have access to the Grade 1, which means they cannot proactively gain those markers, the protect player can just hold on the protect marker and just use it defensively as a perfect guard during the turn and then gain even more value off the protect marker, and then the Chaos Breaker Dragon at the end of the player turn to unlock everything cannot remove any marker, thus the Chaos Breaker Dragon player doesn't gain any extra value over time. So as we can see, Chaos Breaker Dragon has a lot of potential, but at the same time, a lot of inherent flaws, because there are definitely counterplay options available to any deck out there. Protect decks that can remove their field, or any type of OTK strategies are basically the bane of the existence of Chaos Breaker Dragon. But what Chaos Breaker Dragon thrives on is decks that can accelerate any type of marker, and currently we live in an environment where that is the norm. So even though there's a lot of counterplay options available to us, it's definitely going to shake up the meta. Chaos Breaker Dragon is going to impact the meta, if you like it or not. That's going to be a fact. But is it going to be game defining or game breaking? Not necessarily, because we're going to probably see a shift to different strategies that doesn't really rely on accelerating markers and just utilizing their skills on a higher efficiency, and probably some way to counterplay this kind of strategies. Now granted, this is just the basics. We just have 2 support cards for Chaos Breaker Dragon and that's it. And of course the Cyber Dragon archetype. If Bushiroad decides to print more Starvator cards, an easier way to lock card and just give Chaos Breaker Dragon more consistent access to unlocking cards so they can gain those markers, yeah, then we might be in a little bit of a problem here. But with the cards we've seen so far, it's not really that bad. There is definitely some counterplay options available to us. So overall, I'm completely fine with the card. And as you can see, this video has been on for long enough and we only talked about 3 cards. And this is the main reason why I wanted to split everything in multiple videos, because I want to go into a lot of details about these cards, because there's a lot to talk about, especially with Chaos Breaker Dragon and with Locke, because those are very sensitive topics in the Vanguard community. So I want to explain the case for everybody that yes, Chaos Breaker Dragon is strong and it has a lot of potential, but it's nowhere near game breaking as we thought or were anticipating that Locke is going to be for standard. Because the way how they implemented it right now, it is good, it is strong, but it's not as consistent, and it has definitely a lot of flaws and counterplay ability. So Chaos Breaker Dragon, I'm very excited for his return, and I cannot wait for players to get their hands on these cards and try playing them out, because I think it's a really good card and a really good engine, and I'm very curious of what the future potential of this is going to be. I hope Bush would learn from their lessons from G and just make it good, but not too overpowered. The moment they start making Locke too consistent, yeah, then we have a problem. But so far, it is looking Gucci. Just don't give them hand lock abilities. Just don't do that ever again. Other than that, it's probably going to be fine. And with that said, we basically include all the cards that I want to talk about today for the new Link Joker archetypes. So let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think of these new cards for Link Joker. Are you excited for Chaos Breaker Dragon? Do you think Locke is too powerful? Or do you think this is completely fine and your favorite deck, aka Nitros, Lucriere, maybe any Protect deck, is going to overthrow Chaos Breaker Dragon or just stampede them into the next year? Just let me know all your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!